August 1857, Cumberland County, North Carolina. A woman 9 months pregnant runs barefoot through the pine trees of the Great Dismal Swamp. Her hands grip her belly as blood streams down her legs. Behind her come 5 white men on horseback, armed with Springfield rifles, accompanied by bloodhounds trained to track human flesh. She isn't merely fleeing for her life. She's running because she knows that if they catch her, the child inside her will be sold for $300 before reaching 1 month of age. Her womb is no cradle. Its merchandise entered into the ledgers of Misty. Edward Whitmore, cotton planter, owner of 143 slaves, and holder of a $5,000 in debt to the Fageville Bank. But deep in that forest, where sunlight never touches the ground, and where white men's maps end in dotted lines, something waited. Something the hunters didn't expect. Something that would turn a desperate escape into the bloodiest night that Swamp had ever seen. Sarah had no last name. She was 22 years old, her back scarred by whips, her hands calloused from cotton, and her womb. To her, the only thing in the world still belonging to God. But to Edward Whitmore, that womb meant money. A great deal of money. Whitmore was bankrupt. The 1856 cotton crop had been destroyed by boll weevil infestation. The banks were calling in debts. Creditors knocked at his door, and a buyer was coming from Charleston, South Carolina, willing to pay $300 for a healthy enslaved newborn, without marks. Sarah's child already had a buyer before taking its first breath. She overheard everything while serving tea on the veranda of the big house. When Whitmore and the buyer discussed the transaction, they spoke as if she were furniture, as if the baby in her belly were a calf ready for auction. The buyer wanted delivery within 2 weeks of birth. Fresh, he said, before they get attached to the mother. The man dealt in what they called the fancy trade, specializing in light-skinned children who could be trained as house servants, or worse. He examined Sarah from a distance, noting her features, calculating what the child might look like, what price it might eventually command once it reached a useful age. He spoke of breeding potential, of bloodlines, of returns on investment. Sarah stood there holding the tea tray, her face a careful mask of submission, while inside her something broke and reformed into something harder, something that would not bend. That night, Sarah made a decision that would cost lives. She would not give birth in the slave quarters. She would not hand her child to white hands. She would run into the Great Dismal Swamp, the vast wetland forest stretching over 600 square miles between North Carolina and Virginia, where escaped slaves had hidden for decades, where even slave hunters feared to go deep. She had heard the stories her whole life. Every plantation had them. Tales of the swamp as a place of refuge and terror, where the natural world itself seemed to resist slavery's logic, where men vanished and were never seen again, where some said communities of free black people lived beyond any master's reach. Before we continue with this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you, and let's keep going. She packed nothing, took nothing, simply walked away from the quarters after midnight, when the overseers were drunk and the dogs were asleep. Her water had already broken. Contractions were coming every 10 minutes, but she walked into the darkness anyway, because the only thing worse than dying in that forest was giving birth in chains. She had seen it happen too many times, watched women give birth, only to have their babies taken within days or weeks, sold off to pay debts, or simply because the master needed cash. She had watched mothers go mad with grief, seen women try to kill their own children rather than let them live as slaves, witnessed the absolute destruction of the human spirit that such a system required. Sarah had been born on the Whitmore plantation. Her mother had died when Sarah was 5, sold away to a plantation in Georgia, and Sarah never saw her again. Her father, if he even knew he was her father, was probably Whitmore himself or one of his sons, given Sarah's lighter skin and the way certain white folks looked at her with guilty recognition. She had been raised by old Martha, a woman who knew herbs and stories, who taught Sarah the prayers and songs that had survived the Middle Passage. Fragments of African languages mixed with English, creating something new that carried the weight of ancestral memory. Old Martha had told Sarah about the swamp, about how it had been there long before white people came, how the native tribes had known it as a sacred place, how the land itself seemed alive and aware. Martha said that when you entered the swamp with the right spirit, with respect and need, it would protect you. But if you came with greed or cruelty, the swamp would consume you. Sarah had always thought these were just stories, the kind of tales enslaved people told each other to maintain some sense of power in a powerless situation. But now, stumbling through the darkness with her baby about to be born, she prayed that the stories were true. The Great Dismal Swamp was a place of legends among the enslaved. Some said there were communities of runaways living deep inside, surviving on fish, game, and stolen supplies. Others said the swamp was cursed, haunted by the spirits of Africans who had died on slave ships and now wandered the mist-covered waters seeking vengeance. The white folks told different stories. They said the swamp was impenetrable, filled with quicksand, venomous snakes, and diseases that could kill a man in 3 days. They said no civilized person could survive there. But Sarah knew the truth that white people refused to acknowledge the swamp was dangerous precisely because it was free. It was one of the few places in the South where a black person could disappear and never be found. Sarah had heard whispers in the quarters about a man named Solomon, an escaped slave who had fled into the swamp 10 years earlier and was never captured. Some said he was dead. Others said he had become something else entirely, something that moved through the forest like a spirit, helping runaways and killing slave catchers who ventured too deep. The overseers told stories about him to scare the other slaves, stories about bodies found hanging from trees, about dogs that returned without their masters, about screams heard deep in the night. But to Sarah, those stories weren't scary. They were hope. They were proof that resistance was possible, that the system could be fought, that somewhere a black man lived free and dangerous. She moved through the darkness with nothing but the moon to guide her. The contractions were getting stronger, coming every 5 minutes now. Pain shot through her abdomen like fire, and she had to stop every few steps to lean against a tree and breathe. Her legs were covered in mud and scratches from thorns. Her dress was torn and soaked with sweat and blood, but she kept moving. Behind her, she could hear nothing yet. They hadn't discovered her absence, but they would. When morning came and she wasn't in the fields, they would send the dogs. Pike, the overseer, would organize a hunting party. He was a cruel man who took personal pleasure in catching runaways, who liked to brag about his tracking skills, about how no slave had ever escaped his pursuit for long. The forest grew denser as she went deeper. The pine trees gave way to cypress and tupelo, their massive trunks rising from black water that reflected the moonlight like obsidian mirrors. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of decay, of vegetation rotting in standing water, of life consuming itself and being reborn. Sarah waded through water up to her knees, feeling things brush against her legs in the darkness, praying they were just fish and not cottonmouth snakes. The water was warm, almost body temperature, and strangely comforting despite the fear. It felt like being held, like the swamp itself was supporting her weight, helping her move forward. She didn't know where she was going. She was following instinct, following the pull of something she couldn't name. The slaves had always said, the swamp would protect you if you respected it, if you moved with it instead of against it. Sarah whispered prayers as she walked. Prayers her grandmother had taught her. Prayers in words that weren't quite English, remnants of languages brought across the ocean in chains. She asked the ancestors to guide her feet. She asked God to give her strength. She asked the forest to hide her from the men who would come. She promised that if she survived, if her child lived, she would teach him about resistance, about dignity, about the price and value of freedom. The hours passed in a blur of pain and movement. Sarah lost track of time, lost track of distance. All that existed was the next step, the next contraction, the next tree to lean against. She moved deeper and deeper into the swamp, into places where the water was darker, and the trees grew so thick that even moonlight couldn't penetrate. She heard animals moving in the night, the splash of something large entering the water, the cry of a bird she didn't recognize. Sounds that seemed almost human, almost like voices calling to her from the shadows. Then she saw it through the trees, barely visible in the pre-dawn light just beginning to filter through the canopy. There was a structure, a house. It was impossible. Yet there it was, a small cabin made of cypress wood, weathered gray by time and moisture, sitting on slightly elevated ground where the water didn't reach. Smoke rose from a chimney made of mud and sticks. Someone was living there. Someone was inside. The cabin was small but well constructed, built with knowledge of the swamp's particular challenges. It sat on stilts that raised it above the seasonal flood levels, and the wood had been treated with something that kept it from rotting. Around it, Sarah could see what looked like a small garden, raised beds where vegetables grew in the thin soil. This was not a temporary shelter. This was a home. Sarah's first instinct was fear. If a white person lived in the swamp, she was finished. But something told her that no white person would build a home in this place, would choose to live surrounded by the very wilderness they claimed to despise. She approached slowly, one hand on her belly, the other reaching out to steady herself against trees. Another contraction hit, this one so strong it drove her to her knees in the shallow water. She bit down on her hand to keep from crying out, tasting blood. The pain was different now, deeper, more insistent. The baby was coming soon. She had maybe an hour, maybe less. The door of the cabin opened. A man stood there, silhouetted against the firelight from inside. He was tall and thin, his skin so dark it seemed to absorb the shadows around him. He wore clothes made from animal skins and rough cloth stitched together with plant fibers. His hair was long and matted with mud and leaves, twisted into thick locks that hung down his back. His feet were bare, and his hands were scarred, the hands of someone who had lived by physical labor and violence. His eyes were the most striking thing about him, bright and alert, like an animal's eyes reflecting faint light. He looked at Sarah kneeling in the water, and without a word he walked out and lifted her to her feet. He was strong, stronger than his thin frame suggested. He half carried, half guided her into the cabin and laid her down on a bed made of moss and animal furs. The interior was surprisingly organized. Tools hung on the walls, dried herbs and fish hung from the rafters. A small fire burned in a stone hearth. Everything had its place. Everything served a purpose. This was the home of someone who had learned to live with absolute efficiency, wasting nothing, making use of everything the swamp provided. There were weapons too, Sarah noticed. Knives made from sharpened metal and bone, spears with fire-hardened points, a bow with arrows whose tips had been treated with something dark and sticky. This man was prepared to defend himself. He moved with practiced efficiency, gathering cloth, heating water, preparing for what was about to happen. He had done this before, Sarah realized. The way he moved, the confidence in his actions. This wasn't his first time helping a woman give birth. How many others had found their way to this cabin? How many desperate women had fled into the swamp and discovered this impossible sanctuary? Sarah looked at him through eyes clouded with pain. "Solomon," she whispered. He didn't answer, but the slight tightening around his eyes told her she was right. The ghost of the swamp was real. The man the white folks thought was dead had been living here alone for a decade. She wanted to ask him so many questions. How had he survived? How had he built this place? Why had he stayed instead of running north? But another contraction took her, and all questions vanished in the wave of pain. "They're coming," Sarah managed to say between contractions. "They're going to come for me. When the sun rises and I'm not in the fields, they'll send dogs. They'll send men. The overseer Pike. He won't stop until he finds me or proves I'm dead." Solomon nodded. He had expected this. He had been expecting it for 10 years. Every runaway who made it this deep brought hunters. It was the price of freedom, the eternal pursuit. But his expression showed no fear, only cold calculation, the look of a man who had already decided what he would do. He had killed before. Sarah could see it in his eyes, in the way he moved, in the calm acceptance of violence as a tool like any other. He would kill again if necessary, and it would be necessary. The contractions were constant now. Sarah's body was taking over, doing what it had been designed to do regardless of circumstance or danger. Solomon worked with surprising knowledge, guiding her through the birth with firm hands and quiet words. He had done this before, Sarah realized. He had helped other women give birth in this cabin. She wasn't the first to flee here seeking sanctuary. "Push when your body tells you," he said, his voice rough from disuse but clear. "Don't fight it. Let it happen. The baby knows what to do. Your body knows what to do." Sarah pushed, and the pain transformed into something else. Something that connected her to every woman who had ever given birth, every mother throughout history who had brought life into an uncertain world. She pushed against slavery itself, against the system that tried to claim ownership of this moment, this sacred act of creation. She pushed with rage and hope and desperate love for a child she hadn't yet met but would die to protect. Meanwhile, back at the Whitmore plantation, dawn had broken and Sarah's absence had been discovered. The overseer, a brutal man named Pike who had been with Whitmore for 15 years, immediately organized a hunting party. 5 men including himself, all armed, all experienced in tracking runaways. Pike was a professional slave catcher, a man who had made his living from human misery for most of his adult life. He knew every trick, every hiding place, every route that runaways typically took. He had caught hundreds of escaped slaves over his career, returning them to their masters for bounty payments that had made him relatively wealthy by poor white standards. They brought 3 bloodhound dogs specifically trained for this purpose, dogs that had caught dozens of escaped slaves over the years. The dogs were valuable property themselves, worth more than many of the slaves they tracked. They were bred for stamina and scent, tracking ability, fed a diet that kept them lean and aggressive. Pike had raised these dogs from puppies, training them with articles of clothing stolen from the slave quarters, teaching them to associate the scent of black people with prey to be pursued and cornered. The dogs were given Sarah's scent from her sleeping mat, and immediately they picked up the trail, pulling their handlers toward the edge of the swamp. Pike was confident. He had caught runaways in the swamp before. You just had to be patient, methodical, and willing to go as deep as necessary. Most runaways didn't make it far. They got lost, injured, or simply gave up and waited to be found. A pregnant woman wouldn't last long. They would find her before nightfall, bring her back, and she would give birth in the quarters under guard. The buyer from Charleston wouldn't even know there had been a problem. Pike would get his bounty, probably a bonus from Whitmore for the quick recovery, and everything would return to normal. But as the hunting party entered the swamp, something felt different. The dogs were eager at first, following the scent with their usual determination. But the deeper they went, the more hesitant they became. By the time the water was up to the men's knees, the dogs were whining, pulling back instead of forward. Their ears were flat against their heads, their tails tucked, behavior Pike had rarely seen from these usually fearless animals. Pike cursed and drove them on with threats and yanks on their chains. The other men exchanged glances. They all knew the stories about the swamp. They all knew about Solomon. "Ain't nothing out here but an uppity slave woman about to drop a baby," Pike said, more to convince himself than the others. "We find her, we bring her back, we collect the reward Whitmore's offering, the $20 each. That's good money for a day's work." The $20 was nearly a month's wages for most of these men. It was enough to overcome their fear, at least for now. They pressed on, following the dogs, who were now following the scent only reluctantly. The forest around them was alive with sounds-eye birds calling, insects buzzing, frogs croaking from every direction. But underneath those normal sounds, there was something else. a quality of silence, as if the swamp itself was watching them, waiting to see what they would do. The men moved in single file, trying to stay on higher ground where possible, avoiding the deeper pools of black water where things moved beneath the surface. They had been walking for 3 hours when one of the men, a young farmer named Davis, who had joined the hunt for the extra money, pointed to a tree. There were marks on the bark, deliberate cuts forming a pattern. Not natural damage, not animal scratching. Someone had carved these symbols, and recently. Pike examined them closely. He didn't recognize the pattern, but it made him uneasy. It looked like some kind of warning, a message to those who could read it. He decided not to mention his concerns to the other men. They were already nervous enough. They pressed forward, and the forest seemed to grow darker despite the sun being fully up. The canopy was so thick here that only scattered rays of light reached the ground, creating a twilight gloom that made it hard to see more than a few yards ahead. The water was deeper too, coming up to their waists in places, forcing them to hold their rifles above their heads. The dogs were nearly hysterical now, yelping and pulling in different directions, useless for tracking. One of them suddenly broke free from its handler and ran back the way they had come, disappearing into the forest. They never saw that dog again. They pressed forward and finally broke through into a small clearing where the ground was elevated and relatively dry. And there, sitting in the center of the clearing like it had been there for 100 years, was the cabin. Smoke still rose from the chimney. Pike dismounted and approached cautiously, his rifle raised. The other men spread out, surrounding the structure. They could hear something from inside. A woman's voice, low and strained. Sarah was still in labor. "Come out," Pike called. "Come out now, and nobody gets hurt. We just take you back. You and the baby, that's all. Master Whitmore. He's willing to forget this ever happened if you come peaceful. But you make us come in there, and things are going to get rough." There was no response from inside the cabin. Pike nodded to Davis, and the younger man moved to the door, kicked it open, and rushed inside with his rifle ready. A moment later, he came back out, his face pale. "She's in there," he said. "Her and the baby just born. But there's someone else, a man. He's just sitting there watching us like we're nothing." Pike entered the cabin himself and found exactly what Davis had described. Sarah was lying on the bed, exhausted but alert, the baby at her breast. The child was nursing, its small hands kneading Sarah's skin, completely peaceful despite the danger surrounding it. And sitting in a chair near the fire was a man who looked like he had grown out of the swamp itself. His eyes reflecting the firelight like an animal's, his expression utterly calm. This had to be Solomon, the legend made flesh. Pike pointed his rifle at him. "You're Solomon," he said. "You're that runaway from 10 years back. The Jennings plantation, wasn't it? They gave up looking for you after the first year. Hell, there's probably still a reward on you. Might be we make double money today." Solomon didn't move, didn't speak. He just sat there with that same calm expression, as if Pike and his rifle were no more threatening than rain. It unnerved Pike more than resistance would have. A man should show fear when threatened with death. A slave should cower and beg. But Solomon just sat there, and in his eyes Pike saw something that made his throat go dry. He saw certainty. Solomon knew what was going to happen next, and he wasn't afraid. "Tee them up," Pike ordered the other men. "Tee both of them up. We're taking all 3 back. Whitmore's going to get his slave woman and her baby. And we're going to collect bounty on this one, too. Might be the best day's work any of us ever done." But as the men entered the cabin to follow Pike's orders, Solomon finally moved. It wasn't a sudden movement. Nothing rushed or panicked. He simply stood up and walked toward the back wall of the cabin where various tools and implements were hanging. Pike shouted at him to stop, threatening to shoot, but Solomon ignored him completely. He reached up and took down a hunting knife, the blade nearly a foot long, made from what looked like sharpened iron taken from some long, abandoned farm tool. The handle was wrapped in leather, and the blade had been honed to razor sharpness. "Don't be stupid," Pike said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You can't fight all of us. You got one knife, we got 5 rifles. Put that down and maybe you just get a whipping instead of hanging. Master Jennings, he might even take you back if you come peaceful. But you fight us, you're going to die here. That what you want? To die for some woman you don't even know?" Solomon turned to face them, and for the first time he smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who had nothing to lose. A man who had already died once when he fled into this swamp, and had been living on borrowed time ever since. "You're in my home," he said, his voice rough from years of limited use, but clear and strong. "You're in the swamp. This is my territory. You brought guns, but I brought knowledge. I brought 10 years of learning every path, every trap, every dangerous thing that lives in this water. I know where the quicksand is. I know where the alligators nest. I know which snakes are deadly and which just look scary. You made a mistake coming here. You made a mistake thinking this would be easy." Pike pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening in the small cabin. The muzzle flash blinding in the dim interior. The bullet hit the wooden wall behind where Solomon had been standing, sending splinters flying. But when their eyes adjusted, Solomon wasn't where he had been. He had moved with impossible speed, dropping through a trapdoor in the floor that none of them had noticed. A hidden escape route built into the cabin's construction. Pike rushed to the opening and looked down into darkness and water. He could see nothing, just black water reflecting faint light from above. After him, Pike shouted, his confidence cracking. "He can't have gone far. Davis, Reeves, Thompson, get down there. Cole, you stay up here and watch the woman." 3 of the men, including Davis, dropped through the trapdoor in pursuit, splashing down into water that came up to their chests. They were under the cabin in a space that seemed to extend beyond the structure's footprint, connecting to the swamp's waterways through passages Solomon had carefully constructed. Their torches illuminated a nightmare landscape of wooden supports, hanging roots, and dark water. It was like being inside the belly of some vast creature, all shadows and dampness and the smell of decay. And somewhere in that darkness, Solomon was waiting. The first man died quickly. Thompson had moved ahead of the others, trying to spot Solomon in the gloom, when something yanked him under the water with barely a splash. His companions heard a muffled gurgle, saw the water churn briefly with violent struggle, and then nothing. They called his name, their voices high with fear. No response. The water went still. Davis wanted to turn back immediately, but Reeves, a hardened slave catcher who had been doing this work for 20 years, insisted they continue. "He's just one man," Reeves said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Probably just using these waters to hide. We stick together, we'll be fine. We got light. We got guns. He's got nothing but a knife." They moved deeper under the cabin structure, their torches creating dancing shadows that made everything seem alive and moving. The water was warm and thick with vegetation, and things brushed against their legs constantly. Davis was praying under his breath, prayers he hadn't said since childhood, asking God to deliver him from this place. He regretted coming. Doltwendar wasn't worth this. Nothing was worth this. And then Reeves screamed. Davis spun around to see his companion being pulled backward by something wrapped around his throat. A cord or rope made from twisted vines that seemed to come from the darkness itself. Reeves clawed at his neck, his eyes bulging, his rifle falling into the water with a splash. Davis raised his own gun but couldn't see what to shoot at. The rope or vine extended back into shadows, and pulling on it was a figure that might have been human or might have been something else. Something that had learned to move like the swamp's predators move. Silent and sudden and absolutely effective. Reeves disappeared under the water, still struggling, bubbles rising as he fought for air. Then the water went still again, and there was only Davis alone in the darkness, his torch starting to sputter as water dripped onto it from above. Davis panicked completely. He thrashed toward what he thought was the trapdoor opening, no longer caring about finding Sarah or Solomon or collecting any reward. He just wanted out of this nightmare, wanted to be anywhere else, wanted to be back on his small farm with his wife and children, safe and bored and alive. But in his panic, he got turned around in the darkness. The waterways under the cabin formed a maze, and without knowing the layout, it was impossible to find the exit. His torch sputtered and went out, plunging him into absolute darkness. He stood frozen in the warm water, hearing only his own terrified breathing and the gentle lap of water against wood. Then he heard Solomon's voice, close enough that the man had to be within arm's reach, close enough that Davis could feel breath on his face. "You came here to take a woman's baby," Solomon said softly, his voice carrying a weight that went beyond mere words. "You came here to drag her back to slavery, to sell her child like property, like an animal or a piece of furniture. Did you think the swamp would allow that? Did you think God would let you walk away? Did you think the ancestors who died in chains would stand by and watch you do this again?" Davis fired blindly in the direction of the voice. The muzzle flash briefly illuminated the space around him. He saw Solomon for just a second, standing calmly in the water, covered in mud that made him nearly invisible against the darkness, his eyes reflecting the brief light like an animal caught in lantern glow. Then darkness returned. Davis tried to reload his rifle, but his hands were shaking too badly. He dropped the powder horn, dropped the shot, and then something grabbed his leg and pulled him under with irresistible force. He tried to scream, but only swallowed water thick with decay and vegetation. He flailed, fighting against the grip on his ankle, but it was like fighting the swamp itself. His lungs burned for air, his vision filled with bright spots. His last thought was that the stories had been true all along, that some places in the South were not meant for white men, that slavery's reach had limits, even if those limits were defined by violence and death. Then the darkness took him completely. Above in the cabin, Pike and Cole heard the shots and screams from below, then silence. Pike's confidence had evaporated completely. He looked at Sarah, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not fear, not triumph, just patience. As if she was waiting for something inevitable to happen, as if she knew how this would end, even if he didn't. "Where's the other way out?" Pike demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "There's got to be another door, another exit from this place. Tell me now." Sarah said nothing, just held her baby closer. The child had stopped nursing and was looking around with the unfocused gaze of the newborn, completely unaware that 3 men had just died violently below them, completely innocent of the horror that surrounded his first moments of life. Pike grabbed Sarah by the arm, dragging her roughly to her feet. She gasped in pain, still weak from the birth, but Pike didn't care. "You're coming with me," he said desperately. "You're my ticket out of here. He won't hurt you. You're what he's protecting. So you're going to walk ahead of me, and we're going to leave this place. And if he tries anything, I'll put a bullet in your head. You understand?" But as Pike pulled Sarah toward the cabin door, Solomon emerged from the trapdoor like some swamp creature rising from the depths. He was covered in blood and mud, barely recognizable as human. His clothes were soaked and clinging to his thin frame. In one hand he held the long knife, its blade now red with blood that dripped onto the cabin floor. In the other hand he held something that made Pike's stomach turn, the scalp of one of the dead hunters, a trophy taken in the manner of old wars, proof of kills made in battle. Solomon looked at Pike with those strange, bright eyes, and Pike realized with absolute certainty that he was not dealing with a runaway slave, not dealing with a man at all in any way he understood. He was dealing with something that had been created by 10 years of solitude and survival, by being hunted and having to become a hunter himself, by being pushed so far beyond the boundaries of normal human experience that he had found something else on the other side. something primal and ancient, and utterly without mercy. Cole, the last remaining hunter besides Pike, lost his nerve completely. He bolted for the door, preferring to take his chances in the swamp, rather than face whatever Solomon had become. He made it 3 steps outside before he triggered one of Solomon's traps, carefully positioned around the cabin's perimeter, for exactly this purpose. It was a snare made from vines and weighted with logs, a device Solomon had perfected over years of defending his territory. The trap caught Cole's leg and yanked him into the air with such force that Pike heard bones break. Cole hung upside down, screaming, his rifle falling to the ground below him. Solomon walked calmly outside, his movements unhurried, almost casual. He approached the struggling man with the same expression he might wear while checking a fish trap or inspecting a snared rabbit. Cole begged, pleading for his life, offering money, promising never to return, swearing he would tell everyone the woman had died. But Solomon didn't hesitate. He drew the knife across Cole's throat in one smooth motion, and blood poured down onto the ground, feeding the earth that had sheltered Solomon for so long, returning to the swamp what the swamp had provided. Pike was alone now. He still had his rifle, still had Sarah as a hostage, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the weapon. Sweat poured down his face despite the morning coolness. His breath came in short gasps. "I'll kill her," he said desperately, pressing the rifle barrel against Sarah's temple. "I swear to God, I'll shoot her right now. If you come any closer, I'll kill her and the baby both. Is that what you want? You want them dead?" Solomon stopped at the cabin door. For the first time since emerging from the water, he looked uncertain. He glanced at Sarah, at the baby in her arms who was starting to fuss, sensing his mother's fear, and something human flickered in Solomon's eyes. He had saved other runaways over the years, helped them, given them food and guidance, sent them north toward freedom. But he had never cared about them. Not really. They were just people passing through his territory, fellow fugitives seeking shelter. He helped them because it was the right thing to do, because any slave who made it this deep deserved assistance, but he felt no personal connection. But Sarah was different. She had given birth in his cabin, had brought new life into this place of death. She had chosen his home, chosen him as her sanctuary in the most vulnerable moment of her life. And the baby, that innocent child who had done nothing except have the misfortune of being born black in a world that saw him as property, deserved a chance that Solomon himself had never truly had. That child deserved to live free, to grow up knowing his own worth, to never feel the weight of chains or the sting of a whip. If Pike killed them now, everything Solomon had built, everything he had survived for, would be meaningless. "You let her go," Solomon said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "And I let you live. You walk out that door, you leave the swamp, and you tell everyone that Sarah died in childbirth. Tell them the baby died, too. Tell them you found their bodies deep in the swamp and couldn't recover them. Tell them whatever story keeps them from coming back here. Do that, and you see tomorrow, you get to go home to whatever family you've got waiting. You get to live. But you hurt her. You hurt that child. I promise you this, your death will take days. I'll keep you alive and screaming for as long as I can. I learned things in this swamp, things about pain and how much a man can endure. You don't want to find out what I know." Pike wanted to believe him. God, how he wanted to believe him. His whole body was shaking with fear and adrenaline. But he had just seen this man kill 4 hunters with barely any effort, had seen him collect trophies like some savage warrior from a nightmare. Pike's hand tightened on his rifle, finger on the trigger, pointed at Sarah's head. One squeeze, and she would die. But Pike looked into Solomon's eyes and saw something there that made his decision for him. He saw that, if he killed Sarah, his own death would not be quick. Solomon would make it last, would make it hurt beyond anything Pike could imagine, would make sure Pike understood exactly what he had tried to do, and make him regret it with every fiber of his being. Pike lowered the rifle slowly, his entire body trembling. He stepped away from Sarah, keeping his eyes on Solomon, expecting at any moment to feel a knife in his back. But Solomon didn't move, just stood there in the doorway, covered in blood and mud, watching Pike retreat with those unnaturally calm eyes. Pike reached the door, stepped outside into the swamp's humid air, and started walking. He didn't run, knowing instinctively that running would trigger pursuit, the way running triggers a predator's chase instinct. He just walked steadily, following the path back the way they had come, guided by marks the hunting party had left on trees. He walked for hours, his mind blank with shock and residual terror. Every sound made him jump. Every shadow seemed to hide Solomon's form, but Solomon never came. Pike emerged from the swamp in late afternoon alone, covered in mud, without the dogs or the other hunters. People from the plantation came running when they saw him, asking what happened, where the others were, whether he had found the runaway. Pike looked at them with dead eyes and told the lie that would save his life, the story Solomon had demanded. "She's dead," he said flatly, his voice empty of emotion. "Went into labor deep in the swamp. Bled out before we could get to her. Baby was stillborn. We tried to bring the bodies back, but the swamp, the water was too deep, too dangerous. The other men, they got separated from me trying to find a way out. I barely made it myself. The swamp took them. Ain't nothing we can do about it now. They're gone. All gone." Nobody questioned the story too closely. Men disappeared in the great dismal swamp all the time. It was a dangerous place. Everyone knew that. Quicksand, snakes, alligators, disease. Any of 100 things could kill you in there. The dogs never came back either, presumably lost or killed, or simply run off in terror. Whitmore was furious about losing his investment, about the 300 he would never collect from the Charleston buyer. But there was nothing to be done. He couldn't sell a dead woman's baby. He couldn't even recover the bodies to prove they were really dead. The buyer from Charleston went home disappointed, muttering about the unreliability of the slave trade, about how difficult it was to conduct business in such primitive conditions. And Pike never entered the swamp again. Couldn't even look in its direction, without his hands starting to shake, without seeing Solomon's calm eyes and remembering the blood dripping from that long knife. He quit his job as overseer within a month, moved to Virginia, took work as a farmhand instead. He never told anyone the full story of what happened that day. Some nightmares are too terrible to speak aloud. Back in the cabin, Sarah held her son and cried. Not from fear or pain now, but from relief and something else. Something she didn't have words for. A feeling of vindication, of victory, of having struck back against a system that had tried to own her completely. Solomon had saved her. This man, who was barely human anymore, who had become something wild and dangerous, had chosen to protect her and her child. He had killed for them, had risked his sanctuary, his carefully maintained safety, to defend her right to give birth free. Solomon was cleaning his knife now, methodical and calm, as if what had just happened was nothing unusual. Just another day in his decade-long war against the slave-holding world. Sarah watched him and realized that this cabin, this dark place in the deepest part of the swamp, was safer than any church or free state could ever be. Because Solomon didn't just offer sanctuary, he enforced it absolutely. With violence that matched the violence of the system, they had both fled. Over the next few days, Sarah recovered her strength while Solomon cared for her in his rough but effective way. He brought her food he had caught and preserved. Fish smoked over slow fires, venison jerked with herbs, vegetables from his small garden. He showed her how to nurse the baby properly, how to keep him clean and warm, how to recognize signs of illness. He made sure she had clean water from a spring he had found deep in the swamp, water that tasted pure and sweet, despite the brackish pools that surrounded them. And slowly, as her body healed and her strength returned, they began to talk. Solomon's story emerged in fragments, told over evening fires while the baby slept. He had been born on the Jennings plantation in Virginia 35 years ago. His mother had died when he was young. His father sold away before Solomon was old enough to remember him. He had been a field hand working tobacco and corn, beaten regularly by an overseer who enjoyed inflicting pain. At 25, he had tried to escape, was caught, and received 100 lashes as punishment. The scars still covered his back, thick ridges of destroyed tissue. At 27, he tried again, made it 50 miles north before being caught by slave catchers, and was returned. This time the punishment was worse. They sold his wife and daughter south, took away the only things he loved as punishment for his defiance. That was when something broke inside him. Or maybe something clarified. He realized that there was no point in running north, in trying to reach free states where laws supposedly protected him. Those laws were paper and promise, easily ignored when money was involved. Slave catchers operated in northern states with impunity, kidnapping free black people and selling them south. But the swamp was different. The swamp didn't care about laws or property rights. The swamp was vast and dangerous and free in a way that no government could guarantee. So he ran again, this time with no destination except away, deeper and deeper into the wilderness until he found this place. For the first year, he nearly died a dozen times. Disease, starvation, accidents, all of them nearly killed him. But he learned which plants could be eaten and which were poison, learned to fish and trap and hunt, learned to read weather and animals, to understand the swamp's rhythms and dangers. And most importantly, he learned that he was not alone. There were others living in the swamp, other runaways who had found freedom in the wilderness. They helped each other, traded knowledge and supplies, created an informal network of survival that stretched across the entire vast wetland. But Solomon had gone deeper than most, farther from civilization into places where even other runaways feared to go. He had built this cabin in a location so remote that no one would stumble across it by accident, and he had become something the others whispered about with a mixture of respect and fear. He had become a warrior. He didn't just survive. He actively defended the swamp against intrusion. When slave hunters came too deep, they didn't come back. When overseers ventured into his territory, they vanished. Solomon had declared war on the system that had destroyed his life. And he fought that war with every skill he had learned. How many? Sarah asked one night as they sat by the fire. How many men have you killed? Solomon was quiet for a long time, lost count after the first year. He finally said, maybe 20, maybe more. Some were slave catchers. Some were just men who came into the swamp for other reasons, but threatened people I was protecting. Each time I tell myself it's the last time, that maybe now they'll learn to stay away. But they never do. They keep coming, and I keep doing what's necessary. Sarah understood. She had seen what was necessary, had watched Solomon kill 4 men without hesitation or remorse, and she didn't judge him for it. How could she? He was doing what the law refused to do, protecting black lives with the same fervor and violence that white men used to protect their property. What happens now? She asked. What happens to me and my boy? You can stay as long as you need, Solomon said, looking at her with those strange bright eyes. Or I can guide you north when you're strong enough, toward Virginia and then beyond. There are routes, safe houses, people who help. It's dangerous but possible. Harriet Tubman herself has used paths through this swamp. Others have made it. You could too. He paused, then continued. Or you can stay here, build another cabin nearby. Raise your boy where he'll never know chains, where he'll grow up free and wild and dangerous like this place. Others will come eventually, other runaways who hear the stories. We could make a community here, deep enough that they can't touch us, strong enough to defend ourselves. Sarah looked down at her son's sleeping face. He didn't have a name yet. She had been waiting, wanting to choose carefully, wanting to give him a name that meant something. That carried weight and hope and defiance. She thought about everything she had gone through to bring him into the world, about the men who had died trying to take him, about the choice Solomon was offering her. "I'll stay," she said finally, her voice firm with conviction. "At least for now. At least until he's stronger and I know what direction to go. But we'll need to give him a name. Can't keep calling him the baby forever." That night, Sarah performed a ceremony of her own creation, mixing elements of Christianity with older traditions. Prayers and practices that had survived the Middle Passage and slavery itself. She took a piece of cloth Solomon had given her and wrapped it around her son, then held him up toward the smoke hole in the cabin's roof, where she could see stars through the opening. The same stars that had guided her ancestors across the ocean, that had watched over centuries of suffering and resistance. "His name is Freedom," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Because that's what he is. That's what he'll always be. Born free in a place that don't belong to them. Born into blood and violence, but also into love and hope. Freedom is his name and his destiny and his birthright. This child will never wear chains, will never call another man master, will grow up knowing his own worth and the price that was paid for his liberty." Solomon watched from across the cabin, and for the first time in 10 years, he felt something other than the cold calculus of survival and the hot satisfaction of revenge. He felt hope, not for himself, he was too far gone for that, had seen and done too much to ever truly be at peace. But for Sarah and Freedom, for the possibility that maybe, just maybe, something good could grow in this dark place. That the violence and sacrifice might produce something worth all the blood and pain. Word of what happened spread slowly through the slave communities across Cumberland County and beyond. The story changed with each telling, growing larger and stranger, as stories do. Some said Solomon had killed 20 men, not just 4. Some said he was a conjure man who could command the spirits of the swamp, who could call animals to fight for him and make plants grow into barriers. Some said he couldn't be killed by regular bullets, that he'd made a deal with dark forces that gave him supernatural powers. The stories took on mythic proportions, transforming a desperate fight for survival into legend. White folks heard different versions, stories carefully crafted to instill fear and discourage pursuit. Stories about bloodthirsty savages living in the wilderness, about the terrible dangers of the swamp, about why it was foolish and possibly suicidal to pursue runaways too far into that green darkness. Planters began to accept that slaves who made it deep into the great dismal swamp were simply gone, lost to a wilderness that protected them more effectively than any law ever could. But among the enslaved, the story meant something else entirely, something precious and powerful. It meant that somewhere, in a place the white man's laws couldn't reach, a black woman had given birth free, and a black man had killed to protect that freedom. It meant that resistance was possible, that violence could be answered with violence, that the system which claimed to own them absolutely didn't actually reach everywhere. The story of Sarah and Solomon became a whispered promise passed in fields and quarters, coded into songs and prayers, a small light of defiance burning in the darkness of bondage. Months passed, then years. Sarah grew stronger, and Freedom grew healthy. A bright-eyed child who learned to walk on the elevated paths Solomon had built through the swamp, who learned to swim before he could speak full sentences, who grew up knowing no fear of the wilderness that sheltered him. Solomon taught him everything: which plants were safe to eat, how to move silently, how to set traps and avoid dangers. The child was being raised as a warrior, a defender of the free space they had carved out through blood and determination. Other runaways did come eventually, following rumors and whispers to this impossible sanctuary. Some stayed for a few days before continuing north, guided by Solomon through the safest paths. Others stayed longer, recovering from injuries or escaping particularly determined hunters. And a few stayed permanently, building their own shelters nearby, creating the beginning of what would become a small maroon community deep in the great dismal swamp. They lived cautiously, leaving no trace that could be followed, taking only what they needed from the wilderness, defending their territory with traps and violence when necessary. The community never grew large, maybe 30 people at its peak, scattered across several square miles of the deepest swamp. But it endured, a living testament to the possibility of freedom, even in the heart of the slave South. Children were born there who never knew slavery, who grew up free and wild and fierce. Couples married in ceremonies of their own creation, without need for white approval or legal sanction. Old folks found refuge there in their final years, dying free instead of in chains. Solomon trained some of the men who stayed, teaching them what he had learned about survival and warfare, sharing the hard-won knowledge of 10 years in the wilderness. He was creating something unprecedented, an armed force of escaped slaves, living free in the heart of the South, capable of defending themselves and others. It was a tiny revolution hidden in the swamp, existing in the spaces between the maps white people drew of their territory. A place where different rules applied, where black people governed themselves and answered to no master. Sarah and Solomon never married formally. There was no preacher and no legal sanction possible for people who didn't officially exist. But they lived as partners, raising freedom together, along with other children born in the community. They created something that shouldn't have been possible, according to slavery's logic. A place where black people lived by their own rules, governed themselves, loved and raised children, and grew old with dignity intact. The war came eventually, as everyone had known it would. In 1861, when the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, news reached even the depths of the Great Dismal Swamp. Some of the men from the community emerged to join Union forces when they came south, eager to fight openly instead of just defending their hidden territory. Solomon didn't go. He was too old by then, in his 50s, showing the wear of decades of hard living. But he sent his knowledge north with those who left, teaching them the guerrilla tactics he had perfected, the ways of moving unseen and striking without warning. Freedom, now a young man of 17, went north to fight. Sarah tried to stop him, terrified of losing the son she had risked everything to birth free. But Freedom was adamant. "You ran so I could be born free," he told her. "Now I've got to fight so others can be free too." "That's what you taught me, Mama." "That's what Solomon taught me. Freedom ain't free. It costs blood and sacrifice. I've got to pay that price." He joined the United States Colored Troops, one of the regiments of black soldiers who fought with distinction despite facing discrimination even within Union ranks. He survived the war, came back to the swamp afterward with medals and stories, with knowledge of a wider world that Sarah and Solomon had only imagined. He told them about battles and politics, about Lincoln and emancipation, about a future that seemed simultaneously hopeful and uncertain. When the war ended and slavery was officially abolished, people emerged from the Great Dismal Swamp who had been living there for decades. Former slaves who had never been caught, children who had been born and raised free in the wilderness, families who had survived against every odds. The larger world was shocked to learn that such communities had existed, that freedom had been possible even before emancipation, if you were willing to pay its price in isolation and constant vigilance. Some of them integrated into newly free black communities in nearby towns. Others stayed in the swamp, reluctant to leave the place that had sheltered them, skeptical of promises made by a government that had allowed slavery to exist for so long. Solomon stayed until he died in 1873, found one morning by Sarah, lying peacefully in the cabin he had built, the same cabin where freedom had been born 16 years earlier. He was buried in the swamp he had defended for 30 years, a warrior who had fought his own war against slavery and won, at least in this small corner of the world. Sarah lived longer, saw her grandchildren born free in a world that slowly, painfully began to acknowledge their humanity. Freedom became a minister and teacher, using the fierce independence he had learned in the swamp to fight for black rights through different means: education, politics, community organization. He never forgot what his mother had done to birth him free, what Solomon had sacrificed to protect them both. He told the story often, ensuring it would be remembered, that the price of freedom would never be forgotten. The cabin still stands, they say, deep in the swamp where the maps end and the wilderness begins. It's been rebuilt and reinforced over the years by those who know its significance, who treat it as a sacred site, a monument to resistance and survival. And on quiet nights, people claim they can still hear a baby's cry echoing through the trees. A reminder of that August night in 1857, when Sarah fled into the darkness and freedom was born. That cry represents something that can never be fully crushed or contained, the seed of liberation planted in blood and mud and desperate hope. It reminds us that resistance has always existed, that even in slavery's darkest hours, there were people who refused to submit, who fought back with whatever means they had, who created pockets of freedom through courage and violence, and absolute determination. The story of Sarah and freedom and Solomon is more than just history. It's a testament to the price of freedom, to the sacrifices made by people whose names we'll never know, who fought their own battles in swamps and fields and secret places, who refused to accept the world as it was and instead created the world they needed to survive. They were warriors in their own right, fighting a war that predated and outlasted the Civil War, a war for the basic right to exist as human beings rather than property. Their legacy lives in every person who refuses to submit to injustice, who fights back against systems designed to crush them, who creates spaces of freedom and resistance even in the most oppressive circumstances. The Great Dismal Swamp kept their secret for over a century. But secrets have a way of emerging eventually, teaching lessons to those who are willing to listen. This is the story of Sarah and freedom and Solomon. A story of rage and revenge and impossible survival. A story that should remind us that freedom has always been contested, always been paid for in blood and sacrifice, always been something seized rather than granted, and that somewhere in places we might not expect, people are still fighting those battles, still creating sanctuaries, still refusing to submit. The work is never finished. The cry still echoes through the trees, calling us to remember, to resist, to fight for liberation however we can.